So formula-based grants, there's all sorts of other ways that we can qualify for them, other ways that we use them. For example, I work at Cal State Fullerton. We have a large Hispanic population. In fact, because we have such a large Hispanic population, we qualify for being a Hispanic serving institution, and additional federal resources are available for those types of institutions. So these formula-based grants are a way to privilege a certain group, or to distribute that money based on a formula that's less prone to grantsmanship in the same way a project-based grant would be. If you live in Southern California, every one of these freeway projects that's funded by the Department of Transportation, there's a basic amount of money we get for highway funds. That's a formula-based grant. But if we want to do a real large federal highway expansion project, we propose a project, and we have to fight for funding with the Department of Transportation, like the new 405 expansion, or the interchange where I live, kind of over by the 91 and the 15. There's a federal, there's a competition every year, because they have a limited number of resources. They have to fund specific projects where they find needs, and those are really prone to grantsmanship because they're really one project that they can fund, or very few projects with a lot of losers. So how do we regulate grants? Well, when the money comes, there's specific rules that we have to follow how we use that money. So there's some federal rules about reducing paperwork. Maybe there's a rule about living wage. Every grant comes with some specific rules. Federal oversight into budgets, so you don't mix the state money and the federal money, or private money and the federal money. So there's all these mandates about how to use that money. Now, if for some reason we take that federal money or the state money, whatever it comes in, to do a specific purpose, and we don't do that very well, it may threaten our ability to get a grant in a different area. So let's take, for example, some grant money that might come from the federal government to the state or local government to help with immigration enforcement. Now, it doesn't mean that the local government agents become federal enforcement officers, but what it might do is it might pay for a local government agent to talk with the federal agency or coordinate with them about prisoner release, for example. So let's say, for example, the federal government is funding that, and the state decides that they don't want to do that anymore because they want to be a sanctuary state, or they fall out of favor and they take that money and they're not doing that very well. They could meet what are called crossover sanctions. So if we don't meet the standards of that one program, if we're not complying with that federal grant in one way, it may threaten our federal grants for other Homeland Security related or anti-terrorism grants. So in the case of Immigration and Customs Enforcement participation with local government, if the local government decides that they don't want to do that anymore, or if they're not doing it very well and they're taking the money, it may cut off funding for anti-terrorism efforts that are funded through the federal government, because failure to comply with one of those grants may threaten performance in the other area with its other federal grant. Now, how does that really work? Well, essentially the government says, we're not able to trust you to do this one grant, so we're going to pull the other grants until you can show that you're going to be trustworthy in accomplishing that purpose. Okay, well, that happens. What you couldn't probably do is, say, for example, a non-performance in Immigration and Customs Enforcement grant, you couldn't maybe restrict grants that come for education. They have to be pretty closely tied together in terms of purpose for you to face crossover sanctions. Now, another thing that happens at the federal level and other levels too is it's called partial preemption. When you are not performing well based on that federal funded program, the federal government reserves the right to come in and run that program for you if you do a poor job at it. Say, for example, the federal government gives us money for our prisons. We are not doing very well at healthcare in our prisons. If we've got a federal healthcare grant in our prisons, the federal government may come into the state prison and essentially take the authority of the state government in that area to ensure that healthcare qualities improve if we have been funded for a federal healthcare quality grant in prisons. So the federal government can take over administering the program if the state government recipient doesn't do it very well. So there are lots of threats when we get this money to ensure that we do it the right way, that we implement the program the way that the federal government has it designed. And those are three of those ways. Now, once again, we're going to talk about contracting. when we start working to try and achieve some goal, we can use grants, the federal government, intergovernmental cooperation, interagency cooperation. Ultimately, we may have to use an outside contractor to do some of that work for us. Think, for example, in order to provide a very, very solid military, we don't build our own guns. We don't build our own rockets. What we do is we put out a contract that says, hey, look, we would really like to have a whole bunch of shoulder-fired missiles, and we like the Army, the Marines, the Navy. They've got great standards and good systems and all that thing. But really, if we want to design a weapon, what we're going to say is we need the weapon to do this, this, and this, and this, and we go out for a contract. And those contractors design a system, and then we buy that. Okay, great. Well, that's good. It gives us some choice. They can meet the standards in a variety of different ways. All that's really wonderful, except when we start relying on those contractors, it may diminish our ability to provide a good or service because it's outside of our agency. Now, contracting has been around for a really, really, really long time. We contracted with our first military in the Revolutionary War. And so there's some real strong advantages for contracting. For example, it allows us flexibility. If we have one really small project, we can hire a contractor to do that thing for us, and then we don't have to hire them. We don't have to hire them over the long term. Think about in California, for example, we need a seismic engineer to make sure that our bridges are all stable all the time on our freeway system. In Ohio, in other really smaller states that do very few federally funded or massive transportation projects, they probably don't need a massive seismic engineer because they don't deal with that many projects or that sort of seismic constraint that we would have in California. So we hire a contractor to perform that work for us. They do that, and then when that contract is over, they're gone. Okay, that provides some flexibility. It might include some cost savings because the contractors don't end up getting the same sort of generous benefits that government employees get. We might be able to compete against each other. There might be multiple firms who would be willing to drive down price. The firms, as long as they can perform their job, they don't have to meet the same sort of the same sort of requirements that public employees do in order to show merit. They just have to get the job done. So there might be some cost savings. There might be specialized expertise. Maybe there's a contractor who really does this IT system really, really, really well, and they're the leader of the pack. Well, if we hire them, then it might increase our efficiency in administering that program very, very quickly, and that would be a massive gain for us to get this really special product. Okay, it reduces red tape. We don't have to jump through the same hoops to get permissions from our bosses inside this very, very formal hierarchy inside government. We can just sort of say we need this product, we need this service to be provided. We can go get that done. We don't have to hire people. We don't have to do the hiring process. We just have to sign a contract to get that done. And then ultimately it reduces the number of bodies inside local government, state government, federal government, so it doesn't look like the government is huge. So we're able to do a lot more services without a lot of oversight in a much more flexible way if we do contracting. Now, once again, when we rely on contractors, there can be all sorts of problems. Like, are there a sufficient number of contractors to make a reasonable choice? Are they qualified? Do they meet the criteria? Well, are our criteria very high? I worked for a consulting firm that essentially never bid on government contracts because we were required to have a higher level of insurance and meet all these other criteria. So some of the contractors don't even participate. And what you get then is, if not everybody's participating in this bid process to engage in these projects, well, then your pool shrinks and your prices go up. It also prevents some smaller businesses from contracting who can't meet those requirements or don't have the workforce, so it doesn't allow growth into that sector. And it might prevent some really, really small nonprofits from partnering with cities, because the small nonprofits may have like 3 or 4 employees, and if they get this big contract, they'll hire more, but they have to prove that they have enough capacity to do it. And so it becomes a cycle of not being able to qualify for being able to partner on issues that they really want to work with them. Contractors sometimes also underperform. That's to say, they commit to do something and then they don't meet that standard. Well, that's a real problem if we're trying to implement government policies to get stuff done and we're relying on the contractor doesn't do their work. How do we punish them? Do we send them more money to get the work done? Do we legally sue them? And if they sue them, then they stop their work, so the whole program fails. So there's like personal soft skill relationship problems that that have to develop with contractors to encourage them to do their work, to get that, at a certain time. And anyway, it could lead to corruption. So if contractors are getting bids over and over and over again, are they kicking back some of the profits to the people who are choosing which contractors to hire? There's all this potential corruption problem there. And then there's some inherently government activities. Like maybe we shouldn't contract out who's going to be a judge, but we need to make sure that we have an efficient system. And being a judge is time consuming, it's costly, it helps us get our programs done well, it helps run this system. Are there some inherently government activities that we don't want to turn over to contractors because their integrity, the integrity of that program is so core that we hold it inside government function? So there's lots of concerns about contracting that it might be helpful, but it also might be a real problem. Now, as we start to think about how we get the job of government done, how we do the law, there's some really important points to consider. There's an intermingling of federal, state, and local and public and private sector roles in society. So as the federal government works with the state government, works with the local government, what is their appropriate role? How's that funding working? Where can we set standards? Some federal grants have come from the federal government for education that require the states to change their standards. And it's reshifted and refocused the way that the states provide K through 12 education. Well, then the states pass those standards on to local government, and then it sort of takes away some of the ability of local government to make changes for how they teach. And so there's this question about what's an appropriate role. And then there's some other questions about whether or not local governments or even state governments should enter into long-term contracts with private companies for economic development. So for example, there's a community in our area in Orange County that has entered into a public-private partnership where the private sector company is going to build a pier, and it's going to be partially owned by the government, partially owned by the private sector. And then we're going to set standards about who can occupy that pier in that redevelopment zone. Well, should we turn over that government resource like land on a beach to a private developer? And how can we ensure that the private developer isn't going to use it for the most cost, but ensure that all the citizens are going to be able to use that? So we've got this question of roles. There's also these questions about how goals change over time, and how do we monitor performance and ensure that the goal is being met if the goal is changing. Well, who knows? There's some information distortion, and when you have to work with multiple different agencies, who's at fault? What did they know? Who knew what? How could they help each other? When did they not? There's some real considerable questions we've got to overcome on how we get the job of government done. And interestingly, when we talk about all these problems, most government programs work reasonably well. So we can point out all these problems, but ultimately they do their job just fine. And so I've pointed out all the problems to consider for implementation, but generally things work okay. And when we're critical, that's fair, but at the same time we should also be accepting of the fact that generally the job of government gets done just great. Now, how do we ensure some of these things continue to go well, that the programs continue on track? We have developed systems called performance management. Performance management are internal systems and external feedback systems from citizens that help monitor how federal funds are used, how grant funds are used, how programs are being implemented. So we can have citizen feedback on those people who are affected. We have formal program evaluations. We have randomized control trials. Actually, most federal grants that deal with criminal justice and other issues have some evaluation component. They force you to spend 30% of the federal funds on making sure that your program is achieving its goals. And so we have sort of program evaluation opportunities to say, this is where we're going and this is how we're doing it. The other thing is that we are generating systems inside our agencies to give us immediate results-based information, so we can make management changes pretty immediately. We have CompStat, CityStat, we have open data, performance analysis, we allow data visualizations. All sorts of local governments are doing these new things so that citizens can have a feel for where money's being spent and how the city's running. It opens opens us up to some potential hacking problems and other things, but generally being more transparent and using systems to generate this feedback is really helpful to ensure that our programs are meeting their goals. We need formal feedback systems to evaluate individuals, but also programs. Managers get to design their programs, and they can just get the information they need, or they can expand it to bigger stuff. This is increasingly used throughout all levels of government.